As expected today, we got a ton of new Last of Us Part 2 information from the media event that a lot of press got to attend a few days ago. They got to play the game extensively, so there's plenty of stuff to talk about. We've seen a fair bit of new gameplay as well, which is all super exciting stuff, so I'm going to break it down for you. Today, one of the biggest stories coming out of all this new information and developer interviews and things like that is the fact that it's been confirmed that The Last of Us Part 2 will not include the Factions multiplayer mode that obviously shipped with the original game. And that's something that obviously will and has disappointed a lot of fans. I personally never played the Factions multiplayer mode, but from what I saw of it, I thought it looked really unique and interesting, and I was actually tempted to try it out a few times, but it's a real shame for that community of Naughty Dog fans who really enjoy their multiplayer modes. While we hadn't heard any information or confirmation that it was ever going to be in the game, I think it was assumed by the majority of fans that it was going to end up in the game, because Naughty Dog kind of has a history of only announcing their multiplayer modes for their games a few months prior to launch. I believe The Last of Us's original multiplayer mode was only confirmed a few months before launch, but it's not all doom and gloom though. In response to some of the outrage and some of the disappointment that fans are feeling, Naughty Dog has released this statement. We wanted to address multiplayer in The Last of Us Part 2. As we've stated, the single player campaign is far and away the most ambitious project Naughty Dog has ever undertaken. Likewise, as development began on the evolution of our Factions mode from The Last of Us Part 1, the vision of the team grew beyond an additional mode that could be included with our enormous single player campaign. Wanting to support both visions, we made the difficult choice that The Last of Us Part 2 would not include an online mode. However, you will eventually experience the fruits of our team's online ambition, but not as part of The Last of Us Part 2. When and where it will be realised is still to be determined, but rest assured, we are as big a fan of Factions as the rest of our community and are excited to share more when it's ready. So this statement basically confirms that Naughty Dog has indeed been working on a Factions multiplayer mode of some description in the Last of Us universe. But for whatever reason, whether it's because resources need to be allocated elsewhere for the single player, or whether it was just too big of an idea for them to implement into Part 2, who knows what the reason is, but it appears we will be seeing another Last of Us multiplayer mode in some description in the future. Personally, I don't know, I feel like the fact that they've confirmed it's not going to be in The Last of Us Part 2, the fact they've specifically said that, to me indicates that this may very well end up being its own game. I would not be surprised, honestly, if we end up at the launch of PS5 at the end of next year, we end up getting some kind of Last of Us multiplayer independent game. Whether it's free to play or whether it's kind of cheap, who knows? It would definitely be interesting for Sony's first party studios to go into the free to play multiplayer market. If we're eventually going to be able to experience Factions again, then cool, I'm down for it. And I don't think they would make it its own game if it wasn't going to be a meaty experience, so there's that as well. Anyway, with that aside, let's actually talk about the gameplay specifically. And from everything I've seen, it's in line with exactly what I was expecting from The Last of Us Part 2. It looks very much like an evolution of what we saw in Part 1, with obviously a new level of polish that befits the next generation of consoles, and just some cool little improvements and bits and pieces. Needless to say, it obviously looks fantastic. I'll get into some details here. It's been confirmed that as you play as Ellie, there is a dedicated jump button now, which Joel never had. Ellie is also able to go prone, so we're seeing, as we take over Ellie as a main protagonist, we're getting new movement options in the game, which is obviously going to add another layer of depth to combat and the way we approach stealth and exploration, etc. So that's pretty cool. The crafting system overall looked very, very similar to the original game, which is fine. We've also gotten word of improvements to the skill system, where in the first game, of course, you'd collect pills and other resources to upgrade your stuff, and the same thing happens in this game, except there will be actually specific trees for which you can upgrade for Ellie. So they're just adding a little bit more depth in that area as well, so that's pretty cool. So that's some kind of smaller stuff, I guess, along with the fact, obviously, as you can see from the gameplay you're watching now, it's absolutely gorgeous. One of the best looking games I've ever seen by far, but I wouldn't expect anything less from Naughty Dog. But I do have to say, something that I was definitely impressed by and was probably one of the larger improvements that we saw was in relation to the enemies in the game and the AI in general. Anecdotally, it looked like to me that the AI was much improved from the first game and from Naughty Dog games in the past as well in general. But there's actually a lot of cool specific details regarding them that are super interesting. It's been highlighted by developers that human enemies will act a lot more human, with them behaving in more natural ways and doing things like calling out for their friends. Or if you as Ellie kill one enemy in front of another enemy, that enemy will scream out that dude's name that you just killed, which is obviously quite a confronting kind of addition to the gameplay. I think it's really cool though. It was discussed the reason they decided to kind of add this level of depth to the enemies is all in service of the game's overall kind of themes regarding the cycle of violence and revenge. I think when we're looking at this stuff, it's really Naughty Dog once again showing that they're going on another level with their storytelling, really integrating it into the gameplay in a meaningful and emotional way. I mean, obviously some of Naughty Dog's death animations in the first game were pretty brutal, but this is taking that line of thinking to a whole new level, where I think I'm going to be feeling pretty sorry for the people I'm killing in this game. Speaking of enemies, we got a quick glimpse of them in the trailer a few days ago, but dogs are a new enemy type, and from what we've seen, they look to be absolutely relentless. Obviously they're fast, but they can pick up your scent and constantly track you, unlike regular enemies. We also heard about a new clicker type called the Shambler, and these dudes are kind of, I guess, halfway to becoming a bloater. They seem pretty heavily armoured. They also kind of act as suicide kind of runner enemies, where upon death they kind of explode and release this lethal acid. So it's great to see that Naughty Dog with their enemy types are doing some interesting things and finding new ways to make my gameplay experience more and more stressful. Those are most of the core details we got from the gameplay today, but I also wanted to quickly mention that I was watching the Easy Allies preview for The Last of Us Part 2 as some of those guys over there got to play the game. Definitely go and check it out, I'll leave it in the description, but it was mentioned over there that the Joel cutscene that we saw in the trailer that I discussed a few days ago, where I was talking about that it looked awfully suspicious that those two moments didn't actually correlate to one another and Naughty Dog was doing some weird editing stuff in the trailer, that moment apparently did exist as a cutscene within the build that those members of the press were playing. So that might be another small bit of evidence that it isn't any trickery going on, that Joel is alive at that point in the game potentially. But at the same time, I also do want to point out, this might be sounding a little bit tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist kind of thing, but it is always possible that Naughty Dog are throwing in these cutscenes to trick us. Even within the demo itself, they could be swapping assets around and things like that. So do keep that in mind, but it does seem to at least in some way show us that maybe this is the real deal. What do you think of The Last of Us Part 2 gameplay that we saw? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe, that'd be great. This has been SirCazz, farewell.